At 10 p.m. on the 3rd of May, 2007, a British woman walked into a tapas restaurant on the ground floor of a holiday resort in southern Portugal and told her friends that her daughter was gone. No broken windows, no signs of a struggle, no witnesses who saw anything with certainty. Just an unlocked door, a ground floor apartment, and a bed that had been slept in but was now empty. The little girl was 3 years old. She had been asleep, or so everyone believed, less than 100 yards from where her parents sat at dinner. The night was warm and still, the kind of early May evening in the Algarve where the air smells faintly of salt and cut grass, and the darkness comes slowly, reluctantly, at the edges. Her name was Madeleine McCann, and within 48 hours, her face would be on the front page of every newspaper in Europe. Within a week, it would be on billboards in 6 countries. Within a month, her disappearance had become the most reported missing person case in the history of modern journalism. Television networks from Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia had all anchored correspondence in a town of roughly 4,000 permanent residents. The satellite trucks lined the roads outside the resort, like a small industrial zone, their cables snaking across the cobblestones, their lights blazing into a darkness that the residents of Praia da Luz had never seen disturbed that way before. 17 years later, she has never been found. To understand how we arrived here, at a case that has consumed investigators on 4 continents, generated over a dozen formal suspects, produced more theories than almost any missing child case in recorded history, and cost the British taxpayer alone more than £13 million in investigative funding. You need to go back to the beginning. Not to the night she vanished, but to the place itself, and to the quiet, unremarkable vacation that preceded it. Praia da Luz is a small coastal resort town in the Algarve region of Portugal, situated on the southwestern Atlantic coast, roughly 90 kilometers west of the city of Faro. In early May, the weather is warm, but not yet the punishing summer heat that brings in the peak tourist crowds. The temperature in the first week of May 2007 was hovering in the low 70s Fahrenheit. The water was still cold enough to discourage casual swimming, but the pools at the resort complexes were heated. The town is compact. You can walk from one end to the other in under 20 minutes. In the Ocean Club Resort, a complex of low-rise, whitewashed apartments clustered around a pool and a garden and a tennis court, feels in that season almost like a private village. Families from the United Kingdom make up a large portion of the early season visitors. It is affordable. It is quiet. It carries that particular feeling of safety that comes from a resort designed to make everything frictionless. Familiar food on the menus, staff accustomed to British guests, a children's creche service, a day program, nothing that requires effort or vigilance. That feeling of safety is important. It is part of how the week that followed began, and it is part of how it ended. Jerry and Kate McCann arrived at the Ocean Club on the 28th of April 2007 with their 3 children. Madeleine, who would turn 4 on the 12th of May, 9 days away, and twins Sean and Amélie, who were 2 years old at the time. They were there with a group of 7 other adults, friends, most of them medical professionals like the McCanns themselves, along with their children. Kate McCann was a general practitioner. Jerry McCann was a consultant cardiologist based in Leicester. They were 38 and 39 years old, respectively. It was the kind of group holiday that gets planned over email in January, coordinating flights, dividing apartment assignments, agreeing on dinner times. Organized, relaxed, among people who knew each other well. The McCann family was staying in apartment 5A on the ground floor of Block 5 of the resort. The physical layout of that apartment would be examined in more detail by more investigators and journalists and armchair analysts than perhaps any residential floor plan in European criminal history. The apartment had a front door facing an internal pathway and a back door, a set of sliding glass patio doors that opened onto a narrow pedestrian lane running along the rear of the building. The apartment was modest in size. A main bedroom for Jerry and Kate at the rear of the unit, a bathroom and a second bedroom, where all three children slept together, in a room that measured roughly 12 feet across. 2 travel cots for the twins. A child's bed for Madeleine along the interior wall, positioned beneath and adjacent to a window that faced the rear lane. The window had a wooden exterior shutter, the kind standard in Portuguese construction, designed to block light and heat, operated from inside by a mechanism that lifts and slides. The McCanns later stated that when they left the children on the evening of May 3rd, the shutters were closed and the window was shut. For the first 4 nights of the holiday, the parents' evening routine was the same. After putting the children to bed at approximately 7:30 p.m., the adult group would walk together to the resort's tapas restaurant, the Millennium, which sat beside the pool approximately 50 to 60 meters from the apartment block. The distance walking along the internal path took about a minute. They would check on the children periodically throughout the evening, rotating the task among themselves, walking back to the apartments, listening at doors, occasionally opening them and going inside to verify. It was not, the McCanns and their friends would later acknowledge, a decision they were entirely comfortable with in retrospect. But in context, in the moment, it felt manageable. The distances felt small. The resort felt contained. Other parents in the group had children in nearby apartments and were doing the same thing. The creche locked at 7:30 p.m., and there was no formal babysitting service available through the resort at that hour. On the evening of May 3rd, the group sat down at their usual reserved table at approximately 8:30 p.m. The table had a partial sightline to the apartment block. The building was visible, but not the door of 5A directly. The evening was warm enough to sit outside. There were other families at nearby tables. Waitstaff moved between them. It looked like any other evening of the holiday. At approximately 9:05 p.m., Jerry McCann pushed back his chair, excused himself, and walked to apartment 5A to perform the first check of the night. He entered through the front door using his key. He walked to the children's bedroom. He did not switch on a light. The room was not entirely dark. Some ambient light from outside filtered through the shutters, and he observed that all 3 children appeared to be sleeping in their positions. The twins in their travel cots, Madeleine in her bed. He spent less than a minute inside. He noted nothing unusual. He closed the bedroom door to the position he remembered and walked back to the restaurant. On his way out of the apartment, he encountered a fellow holidaymaker, Jez Wilkins, a British man staying at the same resort, and they spoke briefly in the street outside, exchanging a few minutes of ordinary conversation before Jerry returned to the table. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Matthew Oldfield, one of the adults in the group, walked to the apartment block to check on his own children and offered to check on the McCann children at the same time. He did not enter the McCann children's bedroom. He opened the apartment door, stood in the entrance, and listened. He heard nothing that alarmed him. He did not go further inside. He closed the door and walked back. At 10 p.m., Kate McCann left the table to check. She entered apartment 5A. She noticed immediately that the children's bedroom door was standing open at a wider angle than she remembered it being when Jerry had left. She walked in. The room was darker than expected. She looked at the bed. It was empty. The cotton blanket that Madeleine used was folded back. The stuffed animal, a small toy cat Madeleine called Cuddle Cat, was still on the bed. Madeleine was not. The window above and beside the bed was open. The wooden exterior shutter had been raised. It was not partially raised. It was raised fully, far enough for a person to climb through. The warm night air was coming into the room. Kate McCann ran back to the restaurant. She ran, not walked, across the poolside area, past the other tables, and reached the group. Her exact words have been reported with slight variation across different accounts over the years, but the meaning was unambiguous and immediate. She told them Madeleine was gone. She told them someone had taken her. The next several minutes were the organized chaos of people who do not yet fully understand what they are in the middle of. Resort staff were alerted. People fanned out through the complex and into the surrounding streets. Children were woken and moved. Someone was calling numbers on a phone, trying to identify the correct emergency line in Portugal. The manager of the Ocean Club, John Hill, was reached and came immediately. Portuguese police, the Polícia Judiciária, received the call at 10:41 p.m. The 41-minute gap between Kate McCann's discovery and the police call has been analyzed in detail in every subsequent investigation and in Gonçalo Amaral's own account of the case. In context, it reflects the reality of that first hour. No one present had a clear protocol for this situation. The resort staff were searching the grounds on the assumption the child might have wandered. There was uncertainty about emergency numbers, and the adults involved were experiencing the kind of acute shock that delays organized action. This has been used as a point of suspicion by some commentators. It has also been explained credibly as entirely consistent with how people behave in the first minutes of a crisis they have never trained for. When officers arrived, they documented the scene as they found it. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry through the front door. The sliding patio doors at the rear were unlocked. The McCanns stated they had left them unlocked deliberately so they could enter without needing a key during checks. The children's bedroom window was open, as Kate McCann had described, the shutter raised from below. The twins, Sean and Amélie, were still asleep in their cots. They had not been disturbed. There was no indication they had woken or been moved. What was absent from that initial scene was as important as what was present. No fingerprints were recovered from the window frame that could be usefully identified in the early analysis. No fibers, no footprints in the narrow lane outside the window. The ground there was paved, which retained no impression. There was, in the assessment of the early forensic work, almost nothing concrete to work from. The lead investigator assigned to the case by the Polícia Judiciária was a chief inspector named Gonçalo Amaral, based in Portimão, roughly 18 kilometers east, along the coast from Praia da Luz. Amaral was 50 years old, with more than 2 decades of investigative experience in serious crimes. He was regarded within the PJ as capable and experienced. He would later become one of the most controversial figures associated with the case, not because of anything he discovered, but because of what he published after he left it. In those first days, however, the investigation was framed as what it appeared to be, an abduction inquiry. Search teams deployed into the countryside and along the shoreline. Alerts went to all land border crossings with Spain, roughly 2.5 hours by road to the east. Interpol was notified. Airport security at Faro, 66 miles away, was contacted. The Spanish police, the Guardia Civil, were given Madeleine's description. And within 24 hours of the disappearance, the media arrived. Not in the way that local stories attract a cluster of reporters, arrived in the way that major international news events arrive, suddenly, completely, and with a momentum that had its own physics. By the morning of May 5th, satellite trucks were parked along the Rua da Escola Primaria and the roads leading into the resort complex. By the end of the first week, the number of journalists operating in and around Praia da Luz had exceeded 100. The BBC, ITV, Sky News, every major German public broadcaster, CNN, ABC News from the United States, all had correspondents on the ground. Local restaurants ran out of food and then restocked. A small town that had approximately 4,000 permanent residents found itself hosting a temporary press city. The photograph of Madeleine McCann, used in those early broadcasts, a close-up image of a small blonde girl in a pink top, smiling directly at the camera with a distinctive mark in her right eye called a coloboma, a partial defect in the iris that created a teardrop-shaped discoloration that runs from the pupil outward, was reproduced on hundreds of millions of screens within the first week. That image became, in the words of one British media analyst writing at the time, the most recognized photograph in the world. By the end of the second week, tip-offs and claimed sightings were arriving from 40 countries. Phone lines set up by both Portuguese police and the family's growing support network were overwhelmed. None of the sightings checked out, not one. The McCanns, with the assistance of Clarence Mitchell, a former BBC journalist and government media officer who became their spokesperson, made the decision to engage the media directly and systematically. Press conferences were held. Jerry McCann gave interviews. Kate McCann gave interviews. They were articulate, composed, and controlled, under conditions that most people cannot imagine sustaining for a day, let alone the weeks and months that followed. They flew to Rome and were received by Pope Benedict XVI, who offered prayers for Madeleine's safe return. They met with the Spanish Prime Minister. They traveled to Morocco, where a reported sighting had generated significant coverage, and it led nowhere. For some observers, the composure the McCanns projected in those weeks read as parental grief, manifesting in the only way they knew how to manage it, through action, through public presence, through doing something rather than nothing. For others, and this current would run through the online communities and forum threads that grew up around the case and persist to this day, the same composure read as something colder. Parents of a missing child should be inconsolable. They should not be giving press interviews. The logic was intuitive and wrong in almost every measurable way. Grief psychology does not produce uniform responses. Composure under trauma is not evidence of anything, but it was persistent, and it shaped how a significant portion of the public processed the case from that point on. What the investigators were actually working with in those first weeks was severely limited. The apartment yielded forensic samples that were sent for analysis. The checking routine had left several documented intervals in which no adult was observing the apartment. At minimum, the gap between Jerry McCann's check at 9:05 and Matthew Oldfield's at 9:30, during which Oldfield himself was not yet on his way, and the 30 minutes between Oldfield's arrival and Kate's discovery at 10 o'clock. Conservative analysis placed the window of opportunity at somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes on that evening alone, without accounting for the possibility that whatever happened occurred earlier in the evening before any check had been made. 11 days after Madeleine vanished, on the 14th of May, Portuguese police named their first arguido. The arguido designation under Portuguese law is a formal suspect status that carries specific procedural rights, including the right to silence, and sits somewhere between a person of interest and a formal charge. Its public announcement, however, functions with the weight of something considerably stronger. The man named was Robert Murat, a British national in his late 30s, who had grown up partly in Portugal and who lived in a property called Casa Liliana, approximately 150 meters from apartment 5A. Murat had come to the attention of investigators, partly because he had volunteered to help as a translator in the early days of the search, making himself available to Portuguese police and to journalists, which some investigators later described as unusual behavior, and others described as entirely consistent with someone who spoke Portuguese, lived nearby, and wanted to help. Murat's property was searched, his computers were seized and analyzed, his phone records were examined. His movements on the night of May 3rd were mapped. He told investigators he had been at home with his elderly mother that evening. Several witnesses, including members of the McCann holiday group, gave statements that they believed they had seen Murat near the Ocean Club on the night in question. He denied being there. No physical evidence connecting Murat to apartment 5A, to Madeleine, or to any crime was found. The analysis of his computers recovered nothing of investigative relevance to the disappearance. His arguido status was formally lifted in July 2008, 14 months after it was imposed. He subsequently pursued legal action against a number of British tabloid newspapers that had identified him by name and implied his guilt. He was awarded substantial financial damages across multiple settlements. He has never been charged with any offense related to Madeleine McCann's disappearance. The Murat episode, for all that it produced no evidence, had a concrete effect on the direction and public perception of the investigation. It established in the public narrative a sense of proximity, a local, a known face, a thread being pulled. And when that thread reached its end and nothing was attached to it, the investigation had to do the difficult work of rebuilding its public credibility and its operational direction simultaneously. The rebuilding coincided with an escalation that no one involved could fully have anticipated. In late July and early August 2007, forensic results began to come back from the United Kingdom. Samples recovered from apartment 5A and from various locations had been sent to the Forensic Science Service Laboratory in Birmingham, one of the leading forensic analysis facilities in Europe at the time. Separately, the Portuguese investigation had requested the deployment of 2 specialized British dogs from the National Policing Improvement Agency, a dog trained to alert to the scent of human blood, named Keela, and a dog trained to detect the specific scent associated with decomposing human remains, named Eddie. Both were handled by a specialist named Martin Grime. Eddie and Keela were brought to Praia da Luz in early August. In several days of systematic work, the dogs alerted to locations that immediately became the central focus of the forensic investigation. Keela, the blood dog, alerted to a specific spot on the floor behind the sofa in the sitting room of apartment 5A. Eddie, the cadaver dog, alerted to multiple locations behind that same sofa, inside a wardrobe in the apartment, in the boot area of a Renault Scenic hire car that the McCanns had rented on the 31st of May, 25 days after Madeleine's disappearance, and to several items of Kate McCann's clothing. The filming of those dog indications was conducted systematically, and the footage was made part of the formal case record. It later became some of the most discussed visual evidence in the entire investigation, replayed across news broadcasts and documentary productions in the years that followed. Within the Portuguese investigation, and in communications between Portuguese and British investigators, the dog alerts were interpreted as potentially significant. The argument was straightforward. A dog trained to indicate the scent of decomposition would only alert if decomposing human remains had been present at that location. An alert in the hire car was particularly striking, given that the car had been rented 3.5 weeks after Madeleine vanished. On the 7th of September 2007, Jerry and Kate McCann were formally named as arguidos. They were each questioned separately over the course of 2 days. Kate McCann, on the advice of her British legal team, exercised her right to silence on 48 of the questions put to her. Under the Portuguese arguido framework, this carried no formal legal inference of guilt. In the court of public opinion, it was interpreted otherwise by a substantial portion of the watching media. Gonçalo Amaral and others within the Portuguese investigation developed and maintained a theory that Madeleine McCann had died in apartment 5A, accidentally or otherwise, before the group went to dinner on the evening of May 3rd, and that the parents and possibly others in the group had concealed her body and staged an abduction. The theory rested principally on the dog alerts, on the DNA analysis, and on what investigators described as behavioral inconsistencies in accounts given by the McCann group. But the forensic picture was not what it appeared to be in the leaks that reached the press that autumn. The Forensic Science Service submitted its full analysis to Portuguese authorities in an assessment that was considerably more qualified than the headlines it had generated. The most significant result, a partial DNA profile recovered from the boot of the hire car, was described in the FSS documentation as a degraded mixed profile of limited evidentiary value. The laboratory analysts stated explicitly that the profile could not be identified as Madeleine McCann's to the standard required for prosecution, and that the evidence alone could not support a criminal charge. The blood alerts produced by Keela were also analyzed, and while trace biological material was recovered from the location behind the sofa, the analysis was again inconclusive at the standard required for a prosecution. Martin Grime himself, in a formal assessment submitted to investigators, noted that a dog alert is an indication requiring forensic confirmation, not a conclusion in itself. He stated that his dogs had a track record of accuracy in controlled conditions, but that in a residential environment used by multiple people over time, especially a holiday apartment rented to hundreds of guests per year, the potential for contamination and secondary transfer was significant. That qualification was not prominently featured in the coverage of October 2007. In July 2008, the Portuguese Attorney General's office completed its review of the entire investigation file. The file ran to over 30,000 pages. The review concluded that insufficient evidence existed to charge any individual, Kate McCann, Jerry McCann, Robert Murat, or anyone else, with any offense connected to Madeleine's disappearance. All arguido statuses were formally lifted. The case was archived. The family returned permanently to the United Kingdom. Gonzalo Amaral had already been removed from the investigation in October 2007, following a newspaper interview in which he criticized British police cooperation in terms that Portuguese judicial authorities deemed professionally inappropriate for an active investigator. After his removal, he published a book titled Maddie, The Truth of the Lie in 2008, in which he laid out his theory that Madeleine had died in the apartment and her parents had covered it up. The book sold widely in Portugal and was subsequently translated. The McCanns pursued legal action against Amaral for defamation. The litigation moved through the Portuguese court system across nearly a decade, producing rulings at the lower court level, reversals at appeal, and ultimately a decision by the Portuguese Supreme Court in June 2017 that found in Amaral's favor on freedom of expression grounds. The case cost both sides years of legal energy and considerable money. It produced no new findings of fact. By 2011, 4 years after Madeleine vanished, the investigation had effectively stalled at every formal level. The Portuguese police had archived the case. British police had no jurisdiction in Portugal and no active investigation of their own. The Find Madeleine charity, established by Kate and Jerry McCann in the UK, continued to operate, maintain a website and tip line, and fund private investigative efforts, but without the resources or legal authority of a national police force. Thousands of tip-offs continue to arrive annually from members of the public in dozens of countries. There was no systematic mechanism to process them. In May 2011, under a combination of formal requests from the McCann family, public pressure, and a review petition with widespread signatures, the British Home Secretary authorized the Metropolitan Police Service to begin a formal review of the case. The operation was named Operation Grange. It began as an evidence review, meaning British detectives were tasked with reading and assessing what Portuguese police had already done, not conducting an independent investigation. In 2013, following the review's preliminary findings, the scope was upgraded to a full criminal investigation. That distinction mattered. A review can only read and assess. A criminal investigation can pursue new witnesses, gather new evidence, make formal requests to foreign police services, and apply for search warrants. Operation Grange's initial assessment produced an immediate and significant finding. Reviewing the 30,000-page Portuguese case file, Metropolitan Police analysts identified a substantial number of individuals who had been in Praia da Luz during the relevant period and whose backgrounds and movements had not been adequately investigated. Not peripheral figures. People who had criminal histories in Portugal or elsewhere, people whose whereabouts on May 3, 2007 had never been formally established, people who had connections to the region that had never been followed to their conclusions. In a 2013 briefing to Portuguese authorities, the Met presented a list of 38 persons of interest. That number was subsequently refined and reduced as lines of inquiry were eliminated. The investigation generated its own parallel structure. British detectives working in coordination with, and occasionally in tension with, the Policia Judiciaria, who retained formal jurisdiction over the case. Budgets were approved annually by the Home Office and reviewed repeatedly, with periodic parliamentary questions about whether the scale of funding was justified. Each review authorized continuation. One category of inquiry that received extended internal focus was residential burglars operating in the Algarve during the 2005 to 2007 period. Portuguese police records from those years documented a pattern of opportunistic break-ins targeting holiday apartments and villas in tourist areas, including properties in the Ocean Club complex and comparable resorts. Some of those break-ins had occurred while occupants were present. The theory was that someone familiar with the layout of the resort and alert to the checking pattern of the adult group might have targeted apartment 5A opportunistically, expecting the children to remain asleep. It was considered a serious operational line by the Met for a period of several years. It was never publicly confirmed as a conclusion. Another thread centered on witness accounts of a man seen carrying a young child in the vicinity of the Ocean Club on the night of May 3rd. The accounts came from two separate and independent sources. The first was Jane Tanner, a member of the McCann holiday group, who stated she had observed a man carrying what appeared to be a small child wrapped in a blanket or pajamas while she was walking to the apartment block for a check at approximately 9:15 p.m. The second came from an Irish family, the Smiths, a group of 9 people from Drogheda on holiday in the Algarve, who encountered a man carrying a young girl near the Rua da Escola Primaria, roughly 350 meters from the Ocean Club, at approximately 9:55 p.m. Martin Smith, the father, gave a description of the man, and later, after watching television footage of Jerry McCann at an airport, stated in a formal witness statement that he believed there was a 30 to 40% probability that the man he had seen that night was Jerry McCann. This statement was introduced into the investigation record and cited by those who suspected parental involvement. It was countered by others who noted that 30 to 40% is a majority view toward non-identification, and that eyewitness confidence assessments of that kind are among the least reliable forms of evidence in criminal investigation. The Jane Tanner sighting was substantially complicated by a development in 2013. A British man who had been on holiday at the Ocean Club with his family during the same week came forward and identified himself as the man Tanner had almost certainly seen. He had been carrying his own daughter home from the resort's evening creche along a route that was consistent with Tanner's described position and timing. He had not come forward at the time because he had not been aware that his image might have been relevant. Metropolitan Police investigators assessed his account as credible and consistent with available evidence, and formally concluded that the figure Jane Tanner observed was not connected to Madeleine McCann's disappearance. The Smith sighting remained. It has never been connected to any identified individual. It remains unresolved. In June 2020, 13 years after the disappearance, German investigators made an announcement that changed the shape of the public case in a way that nothing since the original disappearance had managed. The German Federal Criminal Police Office, the Bundeskriminalamt, and the Braunschweig Prosecutor's Office announced that they were investigating a German national as a suspect in Madeleine McCann's disappearance and presumed murder. His name was Christian Bruckner. He was 43 years old at the time of the announcement. His criminal record was extensive and specific. Multiple convictions in Germany for child sexual abuse offenses, and critically, a conviction for the rape of a 72-year-old American woman named Hazel Bayen, committed in Praia da Luz in 2005, 2 years before Madeleine McCann vanished from a ground-floor apartment in the same small town. He had been convicted of that offense and sentenced to a prison term. He was serving in Germany when the 2020 announcement was made. Bruckner had lived in the Algarve intermittently during the relevant years. He had worked in the region in various capacities. German investigators confirmed, through cell phone data and additional witness statements, that he had been in Praia da Luz on the evening of May 3, 2007. A camper van registered to or associated with him had been recorded in the area during the relevant period. German prosecutors, in their June 2020 public statement, chose language that went further than almost anything said publicly about a suspect in this case before. They stated that they had evidence he had committed the crime, not that he was a person of interest, not that he was being investigated, that they had evidence. The statement was careful about what that evidence was. It did not specify. But the threshold the prosecutors were publicly representing was significant. For Kate and Jerry McCann, the announcement represented the most concrete and credible development in years of waiting. They issued a statement acknowledging it and asking anyone with relevant information to come forward. What followed was the difficult arithmetic of building a prosecution. German investigators needed to bridge the gap between circumstantial evidence, presence in the area, cell phone data, behavioral pattern, criminal history, and the evidentiary standard required to charge a person with murder. That standard is demanding, appropriately so. It requires physical evidence, witness testimony of sufficient reliability, forensic analysis, or some combination that a court will accept as proof beyond reasonable doubt. The circumstances of May 3, 2007 had already been examined by two national police forces over more than a decade. The apartment had been cleaned and relet to other guests within days of the disappearance, before its full evidentiary potential was understood. Evidence that might have existed was gone. In May 2022, German prosecutors filed formal charges against Christian Bruckner, not for Madeleine McCann's disappearance, but for 5 other sexual offenses committed in Portugal between 2000 and 2017, targeting women and children in holiday properties in the Algarve. He was tried in Braunschweig in 2024. The trial lasted several months. In May 2024, he was convicted on 4 of the 5 counts. He was sentenced to 7 additional years in prison, to be served following the conclusion of his existing sentence. He made periodic statements during the proceedings, none of which constituted any admission related to Madeleine McCann. His defense attorney stated formally that Bruckner denied any involvement in her disappearance or death. Throughout the trial, German prosecutors maintained publicly that Bruckner remained their primary suspect in the McCann case, but acknowledged that formal charges required evidence they had not yet been able to assemble to the required standard. The Portuguese authorities formally reclassified Madeleine McCann's case from a missing person inquiry to a homicide investigation in 2022, a procedural reclassification under Portuguese law that extended the statute of limitations and opened different investigative tools. It was not a determination of fact. It did not specify a perpetrator. It was a legal mechanism reflecting what investigators believed had happened, not what they could prove. Operation Grange, the Metropolitan Police investigation, formally concluded in September 2023. After 12 years and a confirmed expenditure of approximately £13 million in British public funding, the Metropolitan Police stated that there remained one main line of inquiry, the German investigation, and that they continued to liaise with German and Portuguese authorities. They did not make an arrest. They did not name a confirmed suspect. They did not state that the case was solved. The closure of Operation Grange drew significant criticism from victim advocacy organizations and from some legal commentators who argued that the public closure of a high-profile investigation carries its own signal, one that can reduce political and institutional pressure on the agencies still working it. The Find Madeleine campaign, which Kate and Jerry McCann established and have run since 2007, remains active. The website remains live. The family continues to ask for information. They have lived for 17 years in a state of permanent public exposure, simultaneously victims, advocates, subjects of suspicion, and symbols of a particular kind of unresolved grief that has no clean social script. As of early 2025, Christian Bruckner has not been charged with Madeleine McCann's disappearance or death. The case remains open under Portuguese jurisdiction. German prosecutors have not closed their investigation. There is no confirmed suspect. There is no charge. There is no body. There is no definitive, evidence-backed account of what happened in apartment 5A between approximately 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. on the 3rd of May 2007 in a 12-foot bedroom on a warm May night in a quiet town on the Portuguese Atlantic coast, while 9 adults sat at dinner 50 meters away. What there is, a 17-year record of investigation spanning at least 3 countries and 4 formal inquiries, a forensic picture that generated headlines far more certain than the underlying data could support, 2 national police forces that ran through their institutional capacity without reaching a charge, a family that has lived at the center of a media and legal storm since the night it began, and a German national sitting in a prison cell in Braunschweig, who investigators in 2 countries believe knows exactly what happened, and who has not said a word about it that moves the case one step forward. Madeleine McCann would be 21 years old today. If there's a case that shows what it costs when the machinery of investigation moves slowly, and what it means when it finally arrives at something that looks like an answer after everyone has stopped expecting it, there's another one on this channel that ran through a different decade, through a different kind of darkness, and reached a conclusion that none of the people closest to it anticipated. It's already there, waiting.